Like ved Kanariøyene på Afrikas fastland lar Europa sine egne kortsiktige interesser gå foran prinsipper om menneskerettighet og fred. Velkommen til SANDFAST, vår podkast om Vest-Sahara, den siste kolonien på det afrikanske kontinent. I 2020 gjorde USAs daværende president Donald Trump noe helt spesielt. Som første land i verden anerkjente et land Marokkos krav på Vest-Sahara. For å høre mer om USAs rolle i Vest-Sahara-konflikten har jeg i dag med meg Jacob Mundy, som er første manusist i fred- og konfliktstudier og i Midtøsten-studier ved Colgate University i New York. Han er medforfatter av en viktig bok om konflikten, som nylig kom i et nytt opplag med et nytt og oppdatert kapittel som nettopp tar for seg den siste tidens utvikling med Trump. Jacob, welcome to our podcast. It is great to hear that your book has been republished in a new edition. I have just ordered it online and I'm looking forward to receive it in the mail. So thank you so much for making the time to join me today.
It's great to be with you. It's an honor.
About the US, I want to learn something about the larger picture of the Western Sahara conflict and the US. So let's go straight to the controversy. What on earth happened when Donald Trump recognized the Moroccan claims to Western Sahara?
That's an interesting starting point. There are several levels to the decision by Trump to recognize or extend American recognition of Morocco's contested sovereignty over Western Sahara. The larger context that everyone talks about is something called the Abraham Accords, which are a series of agreements arranged primarily with key U.S. allies in the Gulf region, like the United Arab Emirates and Israel, to normalize relations between Israel and Arab states, largely at the expense of the question of Palestinian rights, a Palestinian state, things of that sort. Morocco was brought into this process of the Abraham Accords, and we began to receive early indications of this about almost a year before Trump decided to recognize Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara. It appears to be something that was here and there brought up, but no one really thought that it was a realistic process because it would just be such a departure from longstanding U.S. policy, which was to be neutral on the question of final status of Western Sahara. It could be an independent state, it could be a part of Morocco. The United States would wait until there was an agreement before making that decision. Another aspect I think is really important is the Moroccan regime was very desperate to get the attention of the Trump administration. They had not received the kind of attention that the Moroccan regime had been used to from U.S. leaders historically. The Trump administration had done that initially. And there was, suspicions, we talk about this in our book, about maybe it had something to do with the fact that the Moroccans are so close to the Clintons, and that the Moroccans had clearly backed Hillary Clinton in her presidential campaign of 2016. The Clinton Foundation, the charitable wing of the Clinton family, is very close to the Moroccan regime, and the Moroccan phosphate company, OCP, has donated lots of money. Another factor was that the Moroccan regime, let's just say the Saudis were not happy that Morocco did not side with them in the Saudi conflict with Qatar that lasted for a few years. And that also sort of put Morocco on a different side of US policy for a while. What I think is important is this, for me, is the key bit that I think is overlooked, is that Morocco committed itself to billions of dollars, over 10 billion in arms purchases from the United States during the critical year of 2019. And I think that is what actually really brought Morocco back into the good grace of the Trump administration. And then the final thing is, it appears that there might have even been a kind of feud between President Trump and Senator James Inhofe, who's a longtime supporter of Western Saharan rights. And that Inhofe had tried to prevent Trump from recognizing Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara. There was a explosive confrontation in the White House reportedly, and so Trump immediately decided to send out a tweet, and that's now it's history.
What was the response within the US when Trump did this and when he took this step?
Well, the Western Saharan issue isn't a very well-known issue in the United States. Americans generally unaware of the issue, and if it made news, it was very kind of short-lived. But the other thing is that the United States is, of course, a strong supporter of Israel. So the framing of Trump's recognition in the context of Morocco choosing to renormalize its relationship with Israel, which had been sort of suspended during the Second Intifada, that had put a kind of glow on Trump's recognition that made it more positive. And indeed, that's partially the reason why I think the Biden administration has been reluctant to rescind Trump's recognition, because it's now tied up in the question of U.S. support for Israel, the ongoing Israel-Palestine dispute, and the question of Arab-Israeli relations.
Yeah, and that was you actually answered my next question, because how has the new President Joe Biden relate to this decision? Has been any response at all, or like anything?
The Moroccans are unhappy with the Biden administration's response so far, because the Biden administration hasn't wholeheartedly endorsed the proclamation. The Biden administration hasn't rescinded it, which is important, but they've also, for a long period, they said it was under review. So during that review period, it was also clear that Morocco was withholding its cooperation with the proposed UN envoy, Staffan de Mistura, who recently toured the region. So the United States was using this pressure on Morocco to say, if we don't see progress in terms of the negotiations with Polisario, don't expect us to be enthusiastic about implementing this agreement. Because I think the Moroccans had expected that once the United States committed to recognizing that, there would be a consulate in Ayoun or Dakhla or something like that. But the US has actually been very, they haven't rescinded the recognition, but they haven't gone, enthusiastically implemented, right? And now within the US Congress, there's a prohibition on US defense cooperation that would in some way involve Western Saharan areas. So, and that's conditioned on the peace process and gives the State Department the ability to say yes or no to certain defense cooperation. And that's important because Morocco has always used close relations with both the State Department, the White House, and the Defense Department to try to kind of divide the US government.
Speaking of the US government, and this is what is going on right now in the news, at least here, and I'm sure also it's in the US, is Jacob, how do you explain that a government which is so clear when it comes to the Russian interference in Ukraine can be having the opposite position on Morocco in Western Sahara? And I think it's not only the US, we see these double standards in few other countries.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just Ukraine, but it's an important question, because how can the United States have credibility in terms of saying that Russia should not commit acts of aggression because aggression is illegal, or occupying territory that's not yours is illegal? And we've known since the 1975 International Court of Justice opinion that Western Sahara never belonged to Morocco, that the territory is still awaiting self-determination. Morocco does not even assume the capacity of administering power in Western Sahara, and we know that that's Spain. But we also have a clear history of the United States being very hypocritical about these issues of aggressive territorial expansion by force. When James Baker, who was the UN envoy, first visited the camps in 1997, the Sahrawis had a famous sign that said, "Kuwait, yes; Western Sahara, no. Why?" Because Baker had been very involved in the military campaign to liberate Kuwait in 1990-91. The United States took a very forceful position eventually on the question of East Timor, leading to that country's independence. The United States has taken positions on Kosovo and other territorial disputes. So the United States policy is just it's thoroughly hypocritical, and that's one of the reasons why I think if the United States is concerned about its credibility, and that's of course what Biden says is we need to make America a credible country again. Well, the United States first has to address these issues of hypocrisy.
Mm. And I mean, it's often that we see that countries or states, they compromise their credibility when it's come to their own interest. And I'm just wondering, what makes Morocco an ally of the US?
Well, Morocco's been very good at cultivating these kinds of relationships. In some ways, Morocco is a very weak country. It's not a country that has a huge amount of natural resources. It still has an enormous amount of agricultural labor. In some ways, social relations are feudal. I mean, the political system is feudal, or at least neo-feudal in many ways. And so Morocco has been highly dependent upon having these patrimonial relations with France, more importantly than the United States. But during the Cold War, Morocco positioned itself as an anti-communist ally of the United States. After the Cold War, Morocco fully embraced neoliberal globalization. During the global war on terror, Morocco positioned itself as a strong ally against terrorism. And more recently, in the kind of post-Arab Spring world, Morocco has said, "Look, we're a stable country. North Africa and the Middle East is this realm of chaos. Why would you want to undermine Moroccan stability by pushing on the issue of Western Sahara?" And that's been effectively, you just changed some of the wording, and that's been the message since 1975: is why should we destabilize Morocco by pushing for peace in Western Sahara?
And I mean, that's a very smart way to formulate. But what has been the role of the US in Western Sahara conflict? But also, has the US role in Western Sahara been just negative? So what has the US done on a positive side for the Sahrawi people, if you have any example?
Well, I would say there's several critical moments where the United States has played a very negative role in Western Sahara. At the very beginning of the conflict, the United States was well aware that Hassan II, or the King of Morocco, was going to invade Western Sahara in 1975. And we're not talking about the Green March. We're talking about a military invasion, that the CIA knew Morocco was going to use military force to take Western Sahara. And this information did not provoke the United States to use the Security Council to confront an act of aggression, which is eventually what it was. And that aggression was against Spain, which is quite surprising because Spain was a European ally of the United States. If there had been more forceful Security Council action, and we've known for a long time that the Security Council was prevented from acting, then that would have turned out very differently. If the United States had taken the side of Spain, we know that Morocco would not have gained Western Sahara. When Morocco was fighting Polisario in the late 70s and the 1980s, US military aid to Morocco was critical. If we look at every African country except Egypt's in its own category in terms of US military aid, Morocco received more aid than any other country in the entire continent. And that was precisely during the war in Western Sahara, because there was a strong suspicion that if Morocco lost the war, that would destabilize the monarchy and that you would probably get a military dictatorship of some sort, which is what the Americans didn't want, particularly because military dictatorships in the region tended to be very antagonistic to US interests and pro-Palestinian. And that was a major deciding factor. The United States was supportive of the peace process when it began in the late 80s, early 1990s, because they assumed that Morocco wanted a referendum. Morocco said they wanted a referendum. But when it came time to actually hold the referendum around the year 1999, 2000, that's exactly when Hassan II died. And the United States said, we can't force Mohammed VI to accept a referendum, especially because he's going to lose it. I mean, it was very clear that the referendum would probably lead to an independent Western Sahara state. The same had just happened in East Timor. So the United States pushed for a political solution, and that's where the peace process has been for the last 20, 21 years. For a long time, you could say the United States at least was playing a positive role because there was a willingness to accept whatever Polisario and Morocco were willing to agree to in terms of a final status. But now that the United States recognizes Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara and is the only member of the Security Council to do so, is the only North Atlantic powerful OECD country that maintains this bizarre position. Even the French, who are Morocco's strongest allies, have said to Morocco, "Look, we're not we're not going to recognize your sovereignty over Western Sahara." So the United States is in a really strange position and is trying to use what little leverage it has to reignite the peace process. But the United States has never confronted the fact that historically and currently its policies have benefited Morocco more than the cause of peace.
Does it have any effect on other regions?
The continuing existence of the Western Saharan conflict is very detrimental to many aspects of African politics, Middle Eastern politics, you name it. It's the number one reason that Morocco and Algeria continue to have very poor relations. We know that the process of integrating economically, at least socially, economically, into integrating the countries of North Africa has actually gone backwards. There is less integration going on than there was 20, 30 years ago. And that's precisely because of the Western Saharan conflict. So this lack of cooperation has, effects upon a big issue in terms of security right now, which is the Sahara-Sahel region, which is where we see some of the most horrific armed conflicts in the world these days, far more than you see in the Middle East at this point. And ongoing Morocco-Algerian tensions don't lead to cooperation on that front either.
Yeah, but also what I meant, does it have effects on other countries, like if they would copy the same position of the US?
I mean, we haven't seen any countries, at least major countries, follow the United States in terms of recognizing Moroccan sovereignty. We actually had a very interesting exchange at the end of 2020 where Germany said the United States is no longer a credible, because the United States is what we call the pen holder on the UN Security Council, and the United States drafts the resolution. And Germany said the United States is no longer a credible pen holder when it comes to the issue of Western Sahara. And it would be very interesting for Russia, a country like Russia, to raise, this issue and say, you claim to be opposed to aggression, yet you recognize Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara. We haven't seen Russia do that yet, but clearly, this kind of, again, hypocrisy opens the United States up to these kinds of criticisms and makes a lot of statements that we hear from, Secretary Blinken and the White House very hollow.
You said from the beginning that unfortunately Western Sahara conflict is not really well known in the US. And when I was doing my master here at the University of Oslo, I wrote actually about the Norwegian media coverage of the question of Western Sahara. For me, born and grew up in refugee camps, living my whole life there, you think that the entire world know about this conflict. And one of the struggles, first I was shocked how little actually is written about it. And then I found out, it's not only in Norway, it's basically everywhere. Why do you think there is little media coverage on Western Sahara, both in the US and in other places? And if there is some coverage in the US, what do you think about it?
Well, it's an interesting phenomenon that you can think of lots of reasons why Western Sahara should get more attention, and why doesn't Africa's last colony attract attention? I've spoken to journalists who are often trying to cover Western Sahara, and they run into editors who say, well, what's new about this issue, or another African conflict, they sort of dismiss it. So there's a problem of framing that often happens, that journalists can't find a new angle on Western Sahara that editors think is interesting. Even with the renewed fighting in Western Sahara, editors haven't found that to be worthy of coverage. But it's also a difficult conflict to cover. You can't visit the Moroccan occupied Western Sahara freely as a journalist. If you do go there with Moroccan government permission, you probably will get a very distorted or managed picture of what's going on there. The Moroccans have also now made it very dangerous for reporters to go to the Polisario controlled areas, because it's clear that Morocco is willing to target civilians. I mean, they have targeted civilians with drone strikes, even Algerian citizens, and it's no longer safe for journalists to approach the front lines in Western Sahara. The refugee camps are still safe, but anywhere else is possibly very dangerous. And yet there's also a strange relationship often between the United States, I would say basically the foreign policy of the United States and at least the American media have a very tight relationship. If the United States supports one country in a conflict, the news coverage tends to follow that. The media is in some way almost there's a propagandistic relationship that often follows, and sometimes the way that propaganda takes shape is by not talking about something, by not covering a certain issue, by not bringing certain realities to light, and that sort of thing. So when there is coverage, it's often, again, it's very much consistent with what the American government position is in terms of foreign policy. Or if a conflict is not covered, I think that lack of coverage often also helps American foreign policy, because we don't want people asking questions about, well, why does the United States support Morocco? Why are we blocking Western Sahara's right to self-determination? What is why do we have this policy? So the media, for some reason, follows the foreign policy of the United States.
You just republished your book, and I think time for advertisement. If people are listening and they want to order the book, what you can tell them, where they can find it.
Yeah, well, we originally published the book in 2010. We decided to add an entirely new chapter, which was the last 10 years of what's mainly happened in Western Sahara, particularly with the peace process, leading up to the resumption of basically armed conflicts by Polisario, followed by, with Morocco's breach of the ceasefire and the armistice line before that, and Trump's recognition. So we were able to kind of update the book with that new chapter, and then the rest of the book was tweaked to be consistent with that. But so what you have now is I think the most comprehensive book on the Western Sahara conflict.
And what is the title of the book?
Well, the title is still Western Sahara: War, Nationalism, and Conflict Resolution. So Syracuse University Press.
And so I recommend everyone to order the book. I did myself, looking forward to read it. And Jacob, thank you so much again for having the time to join me in this episode. I learned so much, and it's actually very interesting that I wish we could use more time. But I guess with podcast, people can only handle 21 minutes of such a topic. Thank you so much.
It was great being with you.
Hvis du vil lære mer om konflikten, gå til vest-sahara.no.
Many